And some eye-opening numbers to report as the deadline approaches to fill out the 2020 census. We learned today that about half of Nueces County residents have filled out their questionnaire, something one local expert says is concerning. To date, only 54% of residents in the county have responded to the census, which is well below the state and national average. Dr. Jim Lee with TAMUCC says for every person who doesn't fill out the census, that's about $1,500 lost per person per year for the next 10 years. He says that could ultimately impact the overall picture of our population, which in turn impacts business relocation and the amount of federal dollars allocated for issues like education, health care, road repairs, food assistance, and disaster response.
Tremendous impact over a long period of time, because the census, it's what determines our growth in the next at least 10 years, if not longer, unless we have some adjustments or correction to the numbers.
He believes the pandemic could be partially to blame. Nueces County lost roughly $1 billion in critical funding from 2010 to 2020 due to an undercount back in 2010. Again, as a reminder, the deadline to fill out the census is approaching soon. You have until the end of this month to complete the questionnaire. It takes just a few minutes to complete, and your answers are kept confidential.